We can go ahead and go live. All right, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Business and Innovation Q&A. Let's see, we seem to have a whole bunch of questions saved up here. There's one from Mikhail. How do you track if people are working or not if they're not in the office? Well, obviously this year we had the great test case of everybody working remotely, but our company is very geo-distributed and has been for 30 years, basically. And so a large fraction of our people are scattered all over the world. You know, by the time you're really worrying about whether somebody is working, you probably don't have the right person or you don't have the right management for that person. If you're on a particular day saying, is this person working or not? And that's really an issue on that particular day, something is very wrong. You know, from my point of view, there's a sort of a simple calculation of there's a person, there's a job, is it getting done? Are you paying the right thing for that job to get done? Is that person interfacing with other people in the right way? Those are things which are questions that you can ask, whether the person is in the office, whether the person is is not in the office, whatever. I mean, I don't even know because I haven't worked in an office for so long, but there have been times when I visit the office and I'm wandering around and it's like I see somebody and they're clearly goofing off, they're chatting with somebody, they're doing this, they're doing that. You know, I'm not sure that's any different between being remote. The question is the work getting done? And how do you tell whether the work is getting done? Well, in our company, there are lots of roles where we have weekly reports. There are other roles where we have monthly reports. There's some other roles where we have daily reports. And those are narrative type reports that just say what somebody has done. Then there are, for lots of different parts of the company, there are much more granular, specific things like people who are developers, they're checking in code, they're doing pull requests to the source control system. People who are in sales are interacting with the customer, the relationship management system. People in different roles that the company are interacting with these various kinds of granular systems, or the project management system that we have, those kinds of things. And those are other ways that you can kind of get a sense of whether things are happening or not. You know, one thing I tend to do at our company is I get an awful lot of the monthly reports from people end up actually showing up in my mailbox, and I look at them. And I find that it's I can't say I read every word of every one. And there's some where people have been with us for, there's one person, I'm just a person in algorithmic development who does wonderful work. He's been with us now, certainly more than 25 years, possibly close to 30 by now. He's been writing these monthly reports. And I always find it amusing because the last sentence of the monthly report about, kind of the long-term aspiration of the algorithmic development that he's doing has been, I think, the same for 20 years. So the kind of the long-term aspiration always remains the same, which is not bad, but it's just, I'm wondering if one day that will be finished and then we'll have a new long-term aspiration. But so I tend to at least glance at all of these monthly reports and, sometimes I'll respond to them, and sometimes I'm sure people, I don't know whether they're surprised or happy or unhappy. I'll pick out something that was far down in the report that I notice, and ask a question about it or make a comment on it. Or usually the number one thing that I tend to find myself doing in that situation with these reports is pointing out this thing you are doing is related to something else that's going on somewhere else in the company, and where the structure of the company is such that I may be the only person who is sort of, who straddles the management trees of those two parts of the company that have this cross connection. And so it's really useful for me to point out this thing that you're doing is related to this thing in this quite different subtree. You should make sure you interact with those people. In fact, I mean, just to make that point, I think an important feature of our company tends to be, we have a management structure, and it's somewhat hierarchical, as pretty much any organization that isn't completely crazy is. I say that isn't completely crazy because I'm reminded of these attempts to do things like this holacracy theory, where one company we interacted with at one point had structured itself as this collection of intersecting circles. And I remember saying to their CEO, are you actually able to decide anything in this situation? And it wasn't clear what the answer to that really was. But in any case, so the main part of our company is sort of traditionally, in a sense, hierarchically structured in terms of the management structure. It's not quite so hierarchical in terms of people's actual job responsibilities, because there are people who are doing management versus people who are sort of gurus of different areas, and those are slightly different tracks. But the important piece is, how do you get those parts of this tree that are to interact, even when they're sort of separate sub-branches of the tree? And for us, we have a very effective, I think, project management group whose primary role is dealing with all of those cross connections. In other words, once a project is firmly inside some part of some sort of subtree, it needs much less in the way of project management. It can have its own sort of internal project management, but it doesn't really engage or need to engage as much with our sort of central project management organization as projects where it is in principle a project in this subtree, but we know it's got to interact with these other pieces and in other parts of the company. And that's something where there's a definite sort of piece of functionality in project management that is specifically responsible for making those cross connections happen. And I suppose if that was absolutely perfect, then when I read these monthly reports, I would never notice this thing where I have to say, hey, what about this thing that's happening over there? But I don't, that's not something I would expect project management to be able to do, because that's something where it's, I happen to know what the strategy of some other group is, or what's going on. And so I can make those connections. But I would say in general, I certainly will notice if I see a monthly report and I think it's kind of thin, I'll make a comment on that, sometimes usually to the person's manager, sometimes to HR, whatever. And, the answer might be, well, it just happened to be thin this month, or this person was actually forgot to mention that they were away for half the month or whatever else. And sometimes I'll start growling because I'm like, this is way too thin. This doesn't make any sense. Something is wrong here. And hopefully then that, some action will get taken as a result of that, and something will be figured out. But I think that's I tend to think by the time you're on the daily basis of, are people doing their thing, I think you've sort of lost the game when you're worrying about that. I think that people, I know in our company, there are different strategies for sort of staying in touch with people. I tend to think that different groups tend to have different kinds of, we'll have the daily meeting, we'll have a meeting every week, we'll have individual meetings between particular people, these kinds of things, as a way sort of to stay in touch when things are remote, as they have been this last year. Let's see. Other questions here. Well, there's a question here. Okay. There's a question here about NFTs. So NFTs, non-fungible tokens, they are a creature of blockchain. Their first sort of, the basic idea is you have a token that says, I own something, and there can only be one of that token. So if that thing is going to be owned by somebody else, you basically have to give them that token. But when one says give them that token, what really is there is a record on the blockchain that so-and-so, some address on the blockchain, owns this particular token, and then that token can be transferred to somebody else. It's a little bit like transferring, a cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, Ether, whatever, to somebody else, except that in that case, there's a whole sort of sea of Bitcoin out there, and you're just saying, I'm transferring X number of Satoshi of Bitcoin or something to somebody. Whereas in the case of an NFT, each NFT typically is unique. There might be, let's just assume for the sake of argument that each one is unique. So this is a token that represents ownership of something, at least ownership of the token itself. But sometimes the ownership of the token itself can be associated to ownership of something else, either ownership sort of in the real world or ownership in some virtual world. So we've thought a bit about, sort of how NFTs can be used. One of the sort of the first killer app of NFTs was CryptoKitties a few years ago, where you would own a virtual cat, and there was sort of extra cute features, like you could breed your virtual cat with other people's virtual cats to get virtual kitties, kitty, whatever, little cats, new cats, whatever. And there was a whole, each of these cats had a sort of generative art kind of image associated with it. And the cats had certain attributes for cats, I suppose, and different cats each cat corresponded to a token, an NFT, and different cats would be traded for different amounts of money. And some cats got to be very popular, and they were thought to look cute, or they just ended up being popular because they were popular, and ended up sort of having higher and higher prices and so on. So the feature so that in that case you were owning a virtual cat. Now in NFTs, they're a sort of an emerging story of what NFTs are really about. One feature of NFTs is, if you associate an NFT with a piece of art, for example, let's say a piece of digital art, you could just say, this NFT says you have the bragging rights, that you are the official owner of this piece of digital art. Even though the bits of the digital art could be copied by anybody, you can still hold up your NFT, so to speak, and say, I'm the official owner, and you can sort of feel good about that. But one of the things that's interesting is that something that's a little different from the way that, for example, selling art works in the typical real world is if you're an artist, you produce a piece of art, you make an NFT out of it, means you associate this token with your piece of art to say, the holder of this token is the true owner of my piece of digital art. Well, normally, if you're the artist and you sell your art to somebody, you might get paid X number of dollars or Bitcoin or whatever it is when you sell the art, but then it's all over. If that collector of your art then sells it to another collector for twice the price, who then sells it to another collector for 10 times the price, you, the original artist, get nothing more from that. You just got whatever the original price that the first collector paid you. Well, with an NFT, you can have a kind of take-along royalty where every time a transaction happens, the smart contract that is the NFT on the blockchain will automatically give you a cut. Because remember, this NFT lives on the blockchain. So the only way the NFT can be transferred to somebody else is through a blockchain transaction. And you can set up the NFT so that every time that transaction happens, it looks at how much cryptocurrency was used to make that transaction. Okay, give 10% of it back to the original creator of this piece of art. So that's a fairly interesting kind of mechanism that hasn't been applied. I mean, conceivably one could write a contract in the real world that says that, although it will be hard to enforce. The thing that's nice in the blockchain case is it's very automatic to enforce such a contract. So that's an example of a kind of an NFT thing that you can do that you couldn't really do in the ordinary world of selling art. Now, what else can you do with NFTs other than selling art? I suspect there are lots of things. I mean, for example, one thing that I think will probably emerge is you get an NFT as a ticket, basically. You say, I'm the holder of this NFT. So, let's say you want to be able to use some particular really cool, clubhouse physical place somewhere. Then you say, then at the front desk, they check you in and it's like, oh, show your NFT, so to speak. Are you the owner of an NFT that gives you access to this clubhouse or whatever it is? If yes, then you let in, otherwise no. And you can sell that NFT that gives you that access in the real world to somebody else virtually, and then they're the one who then has access. And so you're associating something in the virtual world on the blockchain with a right in the real world, so to speak. I suspect there are things like that can be done with software licensing. And I'm sort of interested in trying to think that one through of, for example, if I have this NFT then I can run this particular thing, and I could sell that NFT to somebody else if I wanted to. Or, for example, I could have an organization which had bought, 10 NFTs for this particular piece of software, and then anybody in the organization, if if they get the NFT, can run it, something like that. I don't completely know how that should work, but that's a sort of a coming attraction for a kind of thing. Now, other things you can do with NFTs, you can have joint ownership of things. You can have things where ownership is automatically transferred on some event happening, all sorts of other things like that, because this ownership is now, ownership is a matter of software, so to speak. It's something that has been put virtualized onto the blockchain, so to speak. So my feeling is actually NFTs are, the CryptoKitties didn't seem all that real, but I think NFTs are actually a very useful mechanism, because they allow you this whole question of there can only be one of it, and you're guaranteed there can only be one of it. Yes, in principle, you could have some cloud-based system with tokens and so on, but it's a nuisance. Why not just use a blockchain for that? Blockchains are well equipped to do that kind of thing. Now, there are practical points, like if you want to say, I'm going to transfer this NFT, I want it transferred in the next 15 seconds. Well, that's something most blockchains don't do. It takes 10 minutes or something, or even longer, to sort of have a block be mined and then have the transactions be confirmed, all this kind of thing. It can, if you want it really quick, then you have to do something that isn't quite sort of the standard blockchain story. But there are plenty of applications where the transfer of ownership of something is a 15-minute story at least, and that's and I suspect what we'll see is an increasing use of sort of NFTs as tickets for things. NFTs of this gives me the right to do whatever it is, would be my guess. And I think there are plenty of interesting applications to be thought through for that. And needless to say, we're building a bunch of Wolfram language capability to mint NFTs and so on. And actually, I'm supposed to do some event with that in the not too distant future. So something fun to perhaps look forward to here. Let's see. There's a question here. Mikhail is asking, do I own any shares? What company should one invest in? I've been what can I say? I've not been a very serious investor in my life, less serious than I should have been. But I have had one principle about investing, which is when there's a company whose products I use and where I like the products and think the company is good, I'll invest something. That's one thing. Another thing is when I know the management of the company and believe in them, even when the rest of the world doesn't believe in them, that's a case where I've invested and done very well from that. I think that the thing is that, relative to the world in general, the one thing you have, if you actually use a product and you sort of interact with a company, then that's something where I feel like one has sort of a real kind of, one might have something of an advantage over everybody else in understanding, is this good, is this bad? Like, we did, like something like Zoom, for example. We did a big study years ago of, what was the best system to use to this particular thing. And we picked that one. And so it's like, okay, so then it's kind of a no-brainer for me to say, well, that would be the one I would invest in rather than a bunch of others, because we just did the work to assess that just because we needed to use it. So that's been one of my principles. I have to say that I have actually made a decent amount of money by investing in random stocks, and I never find it as most of the money I've made by sort of working very hard and building products that people find useful, and we have a whole sort of commercial thing based on that. And somehow that feels like the right way to make money. And whenever I make money by just sort of happening to be, have pressed the right button to trade the right stock at the right time, I never quite feel as good about that as I do about whatever money I made by actually doing hard work. But I think that may be a personal psychological quirk, and I'm not sure that that applies to anybody else. But I've not been a particularly sophisticated investor in generic public companies. I tend for startups and things like that, I tend to avoid investing cash. I sometimes invest time and advise startups and things like that. And I've done, I think, lots of very useful things in that domain, and I find it interesting. I learn things. I think I can provide sort of outsized returns, so to speak, because there's a bunch of stuff I know that is useful to people. And, you know, sometimes that ends up being successful, and it's something which is a financial success for me and as well as for the people involved in the startup. Sometimes it isn't so successful. Sometimes the reasons that it's not successful are things so far out of my control. There might be things where I'm saying to the CEO of that startup, "You really should be doing this," and they're like running in the opposite direction and doing the exact opposite thing. And I keep on saying, "You really should be doing this," and they ignore me. And unfortunately, with depressing frequency, they come back some amount of time later, from probably 6 months to a few years, and said, "You know, you were right about that. I wish I'd done that." And so one of the challenges for me as an advisor to companies, for example, is how hard should you push? In other words, I've now, you know, I've had to tell this story so many times, because it's like, you know, I'm telling you to do this. You think you shouldn't do it. You're going to do the exact opposite, or whatever it is, right? But I'm pretty sure I'm right. And I've seen this a bunch of other times. The people say, sometimes they'll have said it, particularly in the past, "I wish you pushed harder. You really should have gotten me to do that. It was a mistake that I didn't." And the question is, how hard should you push? And I think my best solution to that is to just say, look, let me tell you the story. You know, I've done this a bunch of times. People told me, "Oh, I wish you'd pushed harder." How hard should I push? Because it's like, you know, at some point I'm going to be a total jerk in pushing, you know, sending the all caps email, you know, "You should not ignore this," type thing, or not, as the case may be. But that's, you know, that can be kind of a challenging story there. But yeah, so let's see. There's a question from Crunchy. "What do you think would happen in society if we discovered the genetic fountain of youth? Would I reverse my age if possible?" Look, I think this is kind of not so much about business and innovation, but I think, you know, it is pretty clear that the biggest discontinuity in human history will come when we achieve effective human immortality. How that's achieved, whether it's achieved in very biological form or whether it's achieved in some more virtualized form, is not clear. Exactly, you know, how those technology curves converge is not clear. Maybe it's a mixture of those two things. I'm not quite certain, but eventually that will be achieved. What the future of history will be after that is not so clear. I mean, it's you know, the bad case is everybody's really motivated right now because we've only got a certain number of years to live. We've got to do something interesting in that period of time or whatever. And it's like, we're going to live forever. You know, we can just hang out and, you know, apparently to us today, just hang out and do nothing. You know, that it's a complicated thing. You know, sort of mortality has certain, you know, is a certain kind of thing that gives a certain rhythm to life, which, you know, if you say it's gone, you know, everybody's going to be around forever. A lot of things would be funky about the world. I mean, you know, one of the things that's sort of a funny thing to say, but you know, particularly in science, people often say the progress of fields is measured in a procession of funerals. Because, you know, people start doing something in their careers, in science, for example, and that's what they do. And if they're around in their career for 40 years, then they'll do it for 40 years. If they're around for 60 years in their career, they'll do it for 60 years. If they were around forever, they might do it forever. And there would be no possibility of something new happening, so to speak. And in fact, it was actually a quite notable thing. You know, in the US, there used to be mandatory retirement ages in academia, and that disappeared in the 1980s. I think for the better in many ways, but that disappeared anyway. And it was interesting to see that I think that actually probably slowed down certain kinds of innovation and progress because people did just stay doing in that job, doing the same thing. Locally, probably good. Globally, who knows? But so I think it's a complicated story. What it could be that evolution, biological evolution, actually thinks death is a good thing, because for almost the kinds of reasons I'm describing, that actually it's an evolved for trait, so to speak, and it's then for us to kind of switch it off. That's a different whole science discussion how one might do that, but to switch it off may be a thing that one can sort of evolve to switch it off, so to speak. And in terms of is that personally a win? Absolutely. I have a good time. I'm the longer I can keep doing what I'm doing, the happier I'll be. I've been fortunate that I'm pretty ancient now, but I'm fortunately, touch wood, in pretty decent shape, and I don't really feel older than I did, probably 30 years ago, 40 years ago even. That's partly because I didn't really pay any attention to eat healthy, take exercise, do all those good things when I was in my 20s and 30s. I started doing that when I was a bit older than that. And so that gives me sort of an artificial youth, so to speak, because probably if I'd been doing that all along, I would now be noticing, oh, I'm feeling so much older. But as it is, I started doing those things only in my 40s or something. And so it's like, oh, I'm now feeling a lot better. I feel really energetic and young or something, even though I'm not so young, at least. But yeah, for me, I hope to live long and so on, and I like what I do, and that's for me certainly a win. I mean, I think it is something you notice that. For me, it's been really interesting having had a pretty long career already, partly because I started pretty young in a lot of things that I did. And it's just fascinating to see, this is what happened over the 40-year period. And particularly because I've been working in some areas of science, which I sort of last worked on 40 years ago, it's kind of like I have a simulation of being frozen and coming back to life 40 years later, because there are things where I sort of didn't pay attention for a long period of time, and then I'm back. And some of the same people are there, and I keep on, I think the people who work with me are fed up with hearing this. I'll be like, oh yeah, we're going to contact this person, and I click on their website and I say, oh my gosh, that person looks so old now. I remember them when they were 19 years old or something, and now they're whatever it is, now they're in their 50s or something. And it's an interesting thing, and I think perhaps one of the things that I've noticed in that sort of process of, you see these sort of big jumps, it's very interesting to see kind of what changes and what doesn't with people. There's still very much the same core is there, and some people manage to sort of find vectors in the world where they manage to advance into different kinds of things. It's like, and some people kind of stayed in the same place, and some people kind of decayed. And I think. It's really, and sometimes you can say, well, that's a person where I was sure they were going to do something interesting 30 years ago, and by golly, look what they did. And other people, it's like, well, I don't know, I couldn't really assess what their story was 30 years ago. It's cool that they did something interesting, or or it turned out what they were doing 30 years ago is what they're doing today, and that's just the way that is. Let's see. There's a question here from, well, I can't decode this. I hate mids. I can't decode the handle here, but I'll start off with IH. How much of our software do I understand? From a functional design point of view, I think I understand it pretty completely. It's big and complicated, and I have a pretty complete understanding because I've been deeply involved in the functional design of our system. Now, there are pieces that are sort of subsystems that I've been less involved with, which I understand less of, but they're a pretty small minority of what we do. In terms of how everything works inside, I haven't personally written code that is part of our sort of main kernel system in many years. I use our products every day. I occasionally look at source code, but that's for very exceptional reasons usually. Do I, in principle, know how things work inside? Yeah, I have a pretty good knowledge of that. I think that I am one of the more sort of technically hands-on CEOs that you will find out there. I mean, I remember back in the day, a long time ago, this is probably, when was this? Probably early 90s. I'm going to these software technology conferences and so on. And there were all these CEOs there of software companies, a little bit different time than today. It was before the nerds took over, so to speak. It was much more sort of, they're a real sort of management-oriented CEOs of companies mostly. And I remember this quite large conference, and I remember that people saying, there are only two CEOs who can actually demo their products. It's me and Bill Gates. We were the only two CEOs who could actually demo our products, which I thought was ridiculous and embarrassing. And that's not been the future of the software industry. I mean, the future of the software industry, I think, is much more the sort of the nerds took over, the geeks took over, whatever. And it's much more the people who running companies, at least in the first generation of running the company, are people who are well able to demo and understand their software. In terms of, can I fix an arbitrary bug? Actually, I don't know. We haven't put that completely to the test. There was, but I tend to, in recent years, I've done this more, is, when there's something that has been out there for sufficiently long, it's like, what the heck? I've got a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge, and I don't mind, a few times a year, really drilling all the way down and seeing what's really there and trying to actually figure out some very complicated bug or something like that. And so a few times a year, I do tend to do that. And it's very useful for me. I mean, when something goes wrong and there's some complicated bug and I run into it when I'm using our products and things, I will always ask, what was the bug? Because that's important to me to build up my kind of knowledge base of what kinds of things go wrong. And, it was some, SSH key that was out of date and that caused this to back up and something timed out and blah, blah, blah. It's useful to me to hear that story, because then the next time I see something which kind of matches the symptoms that I saw there, it's like, okay, I can recognize that. I mean, it's the same type of thing. I like to collect sort of knowledge about how things work and what happens. Same kind of things with people. I've been sort of paying attention to people that I knew from kindergarten on for the last, 50 something years. And it's a super great database for me, so to speak, to just know I knew this person, like many, many, many years ago when they were much younger in a different stage, and they did this kind of thing. And that reminds me of this person that I know now, so I can make some potential prediction about how this is going to work out with this person now. Let's see, there's a question here from Yengris. At what level of technology do you think we humans are at? Is it the peak, not even close to the peak? Where are we at? Technology is an infinite frontier. I mean, this is something that, from what I've done in basic science, we can kind of see this with clarity with this idea of computational irreducibility and so on. Technology, like mathematics, like other things, there's an infinite frontier. There's always more to invent. There's always more to discover. There's always more things in the physical universe that you can expect to sort of do something special with, so to speak. The real story tends to be, I think, in technology, is there's sort of this cycle between what do we imagine is possible versus what actually gets built. And then based on what gets built, what do we then imagine is possible? And then what can we build and so on. And I think it's been an interesting kind of cycle. If we see certain things, they become commonplace, then we realize, oh, there's another layer that can be built on top of that. And then, I've been much involved in building things before everybody knew what they were going to be good for necessarily. And that's I'm kind of something of a builder of artifacts from the future, so to speak. And that's sort of I find that very fulfilling to do that. It's sometimes that there are things which are kind of artifacts that kind of bubble up from what everybody kind of knows is possible today, and there are things where there's sort of leadership in figuring out what might be possible in the future. But I think that there's a huge amount. It's sort of an endless frontier of what's possible, because essentially what we're doing in technology is we're taking things from the physical universe and we're somehow applying them to our human purposes. And there's a sort of an infinite runway of things you can do that with. But part of what defines that infinite runway is the evolution of human purposes. I mean, if all we were doing was, all we ever thought was worth doing was, having our pet, our farm goat, and, sort of getting food from the goat or whatever, and, just rinse and repeat type thing forever and ever, then we might not say, oh, we want a social network and on a computer, and we want a cell phone, and we want all this kind of thing. We're perfectly happy doing our, living our life as goat herders type thing. And it's a question of what, do you aspire to? I'm sure the modern goat herders are fully equipped with smartphones and all kinds of other things. I only just wonder. I think it's probably only the humans who have the earbuds so far. Eventually, it'll be for the goats as well. But and then there's all the question of what will be the goat music, so to speak. But anyway, not to get too silly about that. But I mean, the question is sort of, what do we actually want? What do we aspire to? What kinds of things are worth building, so to speak? And I think that somewhat informs the direction of technology. And there are things where people will say, I mean, like in the last probably 20 years, people have gotten very interested in kind of human longevity and so on. And it's like there's more and more that's sort of worth doing to kind of keep us healthy for longer and longer, whereas that hadn't been so much of an emphasis in the past. And so, that's an example of sort of a changing set of objectives for technology. And I'm sure that there will be more changes of objective. I mean, as more becomes possible, if we start to be able to connect brains more closely into kind of digital systems and so on, more closely than just being able to see our computer screen with our eyes, or even be able to project our computer screen on our augmented reality glasses or whatever. If there are more things we can do to make sort of direct connections and things, then that will define things we can then imagine doing, and we can decide, do we want to do this, do we not want to do this, and so on. I mean, I think one of the questions is that technology we shouldn't be developing? That's an interesting question in its own right, because there are things which, in the course of history, there are times when people said, we're just not going to do that, and that's there are plenty of things in kind of sort of things that are pretty much sort of worldwide taboos of, we're just not going to do that. I think that there are places where one can imagine that happening with technology, and there are questions of, do we want to develop let's say we could develop the tiny, quark bomb that would be beyond nuclear weapons and would allow you to blow up a whole continent or something with this thing. Do we really want to develop that? Probably it's not the greatest of ideas. On the other hand, one could argue, does one want to block sort of the progress of human knowledge? And I think this is a complicated issue. And I think, certainly, for example, gain of function research on viruses is one very topical issue in terms of those kinds of things. I have to say, I think that there's a certain, it's a complicated thing to weigh the pros against the cons, so to speak. And I think in some cases, I'll give you an example of something, a very different domain, where it's like, should you do it or not? Let's talk about archaeology, okay? So let's say you discover the lost city of Atlantis, and you know where it is, and the question is, in 2022, let's say, you're going to excavate the lost city of Atlantis. Okay, well, you have certain technology in the year 2022 to excavate that city. As you pull those layers up, you will preserve certain things, and you will no doubt lose certain things. I mean, back in the day when Troy was excavated in the 1800s, I guess, by Schliemann and so on, he had certain theories and he dynamited his way through different layers of what turn out to be many of the important historical layers of the city of Troy. Because at the time, he had certain theories, he had certain methodology, he had dynamite. It's like, let's just get to this place in excavating the city of Troy. Had he said, gosh, in 100 years, they're going to be able to do this much better. Let me just wait for 100 years and not excavate this city now, and then everybody would have discovered lots more archaeology in that case. On the other hand, waiting for 100 years is kind of a bad, it doesn't feel like you're making progress to wait for 100 years. But that's an example of something outside of the domain of weapons and things like this, where you can ask the question, should you do it now or should you wait? I mean, the same will come up, I'm sure, in we're talking about human longevity in cryonics, for example. You end up with eventually people will figure out how to do cryonics better, and it'll be sort of they're a bunch of frozen humans, and it's like there'll be a point at which, is it good enough now to sort of start unfreezing and so on, or are we not enough? Should we wait another 50 years for the technology to improve? So there are those kinds of issues about what technology do you want to have happen, what technology do you want to, when should you be using it, and so on. Let me see. Other questions. It's a question here from Erin. Have we ever designed or sold hardware? Are the skills the same for developing hardware versus software? We've never directly made and sold hardware. We've thought about it a number of times. I've always been very afraid of it. One feature of hardware that is kind of like, people I know who sell physical objects are always like, you guys who sell software, you have it so easy. Because with hardware, for example, or with any kind of physical object, you actually have to get the thing manufactured. I suppose we have sold some physical objects. We've sold books, and books have this feature too. You're going to sell a book. You have to do a print run. To reprint the book might take 2 months, let's say. And people might, you start selling the book, and people might say, people usually think 12 weeks is about the time that a book sells for, sometimes 6 weeks in bookstores back in the day. It's probably gotten longer these days with the web, but I don't know. But it's a very difficult bet to make, because you get to, you roll a dice and you say, I'm going to print 20,000 copies of this thing. It's going to cost me a bunch of money to print that. Then I've got this 12-week period where those things might sell or might not. If they sell, that's great. If the orders came in for 100,000 copies, but you only printed 20,000 copies, you lost a lot, because maybe those people won't even be interested. Maybe after that 12-week period, they were like, oh, that's old news. We're not going to look at it anymore. And you just will never get that revenue. I mean, this happens absolutely big time with things like toys at Christmas time and so on. It's like, do you hit the season? Do you make the right number of cool, animatronic aardvarks or whatever, or not? If you make too many aardvarks, you're stuck with dead inventory. Oops, I just bought $5 million worth of toy aardvarks. What the heck am I going to do with this? If you make too few, it's like there were lines around the block of people trying to buy that new toy aardvark. And I wish I could have had more, because I would have made more money if I'd sold those. So those are issues that come up with hardware. With software, it's like, well, just get another copy of the bits. It's much easier. So, inventory and management of inventory, that's a big issue for hardware. In terms of, can you get the hardware to work? That's another whole issue. And, with software, people who are used to making hardware often, back in the day, the big computer companies, particularly IBM, used to think the real thing is the hardware. Software, that's just a throwaway. It's just like we'll just sort of throw that in as a floor mat type thing. That's part of the legend of Microsoft. Partly has to do with, well, whatever. We'll just have this little company in Seattle make that. It wasn't. It was maybe still in Albuquerque then. But anyway, make this MS-DOS thing. It's just like the floor mats for our computers. It's not something we have to really pay that much attention to. It was a miscalculation in terms of business strategy that in the end the software really became probably the at least for a while the most valuable thing. I think that, to people who make hardware, sometimes the software world looks incredibly scary because software is very complicated compared to a lot of kinds of hardware in terms of just the number of separate modules and pieces and things that have to work and so on. If you're making like a physical mechanical object, there are a many smaller number of components than there are in a large software system. But on the other hand, from a software person's point of view, it's like there's so many things that can go wrong with hardware. I mean, that the robotic aardvark, its tail can jam in some weird way that will cause it to overheat and sparks come out of its head or something, and all kinds of crazy things can go wrong. There's a kind of a pattern of debugging things which I think is different between hardware and software. One of the things that I notice as I sort of work with different kinds of fields is there's sort of a rhythm for how different types of fields work. Like software development has a certain rhythm, making movies has a certain rhythm, publishing books has a certain rhythm. Each of these thinking about different fields of science and so on have certain rhythms. There's certain kinds of things that work, things that don't work, ways to think about things and so on that you get. In hardware, it's the same kind of story of there's sort of certain ways to think about things that can go wrong, which if you're experienced in software, you kind of know the types of things that go wrong, the types of bugs that can occur. Different thing in hardware. Now, hardware, again, in the modern world of hardware, there's this whole kind of ODM concept of you just sort of draw up the specifications and you get some company, very more often than not in today's world in Shenzhen, China, you get some company to actually go and do the engineering for you and make prototypes and sort of ready the thing for manufacturing. And I don't know, I have not personally had the experience of working with those guys, although we've interacted with a bunch of those kinds of companies because they use our technology. But to what level of kind of specification you're ending up giving. And I don't really know, in the software world, I guess there are also organizations like that where they just say, tell us the specification of your software and we'll just build it. My observation of the cases where I've seen that happen has been quite unsuccessful in software. But in hardware, I think it's been much more successful and it's much more difficult. In a sense, I think there's a higher barrier to entry to knowing how to build hardware and having all of the suppliers lined up and all these kinds of things than there is in software. I mean, you might think that in building software, like as I say, there's sort of different rhythms in different industries. Like, in the movie industry, for example, you're making a movie. Okay, you're going to need somebody to do this and this and this, to build the sets, to do the electrical work, to do the this and that and the other. There are these definite job responsibilities which wind up as lines in the credits in the movie. And, a typical thing is, well, there's this organization that I can get this sort of freelance person, and I've sort of worked with them before. Let me just plug them into my movie. They're going to come for 2 weeks. They're going to do this piece of work, and then they're going to go away again. In the software industry, that isn't how it works, usually. It's like there's a project, it's got people. Usually the people are employees of the company or, contractors, long-term contractors for the company. It's not the case that they are just sort of wheeled in for their 2-week moment of, and now you're going to put this component into the API or something. That's not how it tends to work. I mean, people have tried to sort of unbundle the process of software development and kind of have, quality assurance done separately from graphic design, done separately from user experience, done separately from this and that and the other. I don't think that works very well. And I think most people have evolved to a point where one tries to have all those things in-house in a company, all interacting and all with long-term people, so to speak. But again, it's with hardware, sort of a different story. And I don't know so much how that works. Of kind of, you wheel in, you realize my toy aardvark needs a what? It needs a fuzzy tail. Okay, what's the supplier that, actually, I think aardvarks profoundly don't have fuzzy tails, but let's not worry about that. Let's say my aardvark needs a chemical sensor that it can, so that the aardvark can be made to walk towards a bowl of food or something just for fun. Okay, so who do I know who has a chemical sensor that they can sell me? What's the supplier that has that? That's a different kind of dynamic than what you see in the software industry. I mean, maybe in the software industry, you'd say, where's there a library I can find that will let me do some particular function? But it's much less, I think, than the supply chain story for hardware. There's a question here from Abel. Have I created a business supplying cellular automata? Do you know somebody who did? Yeah, there have been lots of things applying cellular automata, my gosh. An early one was using a method that I invented for doing fluid dynamics with cellular automata. And that's doing fluid simulations that way. There have been ones around, well, just all kinds of things. I mean, recently there's a blockchain called NKN, which is, well, it's a blockchain, sort of a blockchain 3.0 or something company that's making a kind of NKN stands for new kind of network, as NKS stands for new kind of science. And it's making use of cellular automaton ideas for dealing with consensus in the network. In fact, we have a conference we're doing with those guys in a few weeks about distributed consensus. That's a kind of a cellular automaton story applied in that particular case to blockchain. But yes, there are, oh gosh, there are all kinds of things. I mean, there's things, some artistic kinds of things. We had this Wolfram Tones website. There are people who've done things like that more commercially. There are people who've used cellular automata in the fintech world for various kinds of modeling. There are people who've used them in environmental modeling, and those have turned into companies and so on. There's lots of different stuff, and I'm probably forgetting things. There are people who've used them, strangely enough, for cartography, and I know there's systems for doing that are commercial systems that are based on those kinds of ideas. It's sort of inevitable because it's kind of a low-level infrastructural idea about how to. It's sort of a class of algorithmic functionality that gets applied in lots of different places. Also, cryptography is another one, etc. Okay, there's a question from Tyler here. Are today's nerds and their enterprises missing out on anything, leaving traditional managerial CEOs out, or do nerds simply produce better products and processes? I think it takes a lot of different skills to make great companies. I've always found it amusing that in the course of the time I've been paying attention to companies, a bit more than 40 years now, there have been these periods of time when people say, the most important thing about your company is it's C blank O. The most important thing is your CFO. You've got to worry about all the financial arrangements you make. The most important thing is your CIO. It's the IT organization. The most important thing is your CMO. It's the marketing thing. The most important thing is your innovation. It's your chief innovation officer. The most important thing is human resources. It's your head of human resources and so on. And it seems like there's this kind of shell game of passing around. The most important thing in the company is this or that. Well, truth is they're all sort of important. And you kind of have to have a mixture of these things. And in a particular company, one may be more the dominant piece of the culture than another. But I think in terms of sort of the traditional managerial CEOs, look, I think there's several things to say. Just because somebody doesn't have a technical background absolutely does not mean that they don't understand sort of the point of something that's happening technically in a company. To say, can the person write every line of code? That's not the important thing. The important question is, do they get the real point, and can they reason about the product and what should happen in the product? I tend to think that's important, but at least that's kind of my lens of how companies should work. I mean, sometimes, I'll run into people who say, I'm the CEO and I'm running the company, And it's like, I've got this innovation person over here, and they're the one who's going to figure out what my company is going to do. And it's like, that's a very weird thing, but I've seen it work a few times of like, I'm just running the company and somebody else figures out what the company is actually going to do. And, even quite large companies have ended up with sort of strategy groups and planning groups. So one thing you have to understand, by the time a company is big and old, many of the issues to do with running it are not the same issues as during the growth phase, so to speak. When a company is first defining what it's going to do and what it's going to be like, there's one set of skills. When the company is big and it's got tens of thousands of employees, maybe even thousands of employees, and it's got all these fiefdoms that have grown up over the course of decades and so on, the management of such a company, a lot of that story is about, keep the warring fiefdoms, happy with each other and so on. Be the sort of the person who is keeping all these different parts all working more or less in synchrony, even though the way the parts worked and the way the company works was defined decades ago. And what you're doing is trying to keep the machine running. And that's the next generation CEO. There's sort of typically a first generation CEO who's responsible for the growth phase. And then there will be later generation CEOs who in many cases will be more in, keep the machine running, so to speak. And that's a different kind of skill that's needed to keep the machine running than that's needed to grow the machine in the first place. And it's a very common thing in companies. I think it's less popular now, but it used to be the case that people would say, oh yeah, you have one CEO who starts it, and then, after a while, if they have investors, the investors will come in and replace the CEO with a real manager, a real CEO. There have been enough successes now where people have gone from small company to, grow it into a large company that I think people don't believe in that theory anymore as a general thing. And it's there are plenty of people, probably myself included, who've sort of grown up with their companies, so to speak. I mean, I think, the scale of company that I have now, probably on day one, I would not have been able to manage such a company. It's grown gradually over the course of years, and it's now, that's not an issue. But so I think if a company grew to, from there's a person who starts and it's got 5 people, and then the next, like 2 weeks later, it's got 400 people, then, maybe it's a different person who's good at the 5-person startup. Then unusually what happens is as companies grow, they go through certain stages of development. Like there's this moment when, there's a moment when there aren't sort of single points of failure in the company usually, or not as many of them. There are points where, the CEO doesn't personally know all the employees, where there's a certain level of middle management that exists, and those kinds of things. There are these different levels, and there are people who have different levels of comfort in managing companies of those different scales. But I think in the idea, I've got an idea for a company. Okay, wheel in a professional manager who's going to just make this company run. I have so rarely seen that work. It's it's not usually the thing. It's something where sometimes I have to say I've been interested in that myself, because there are things where we have an idea, we have technology. It's just like all we need is a CEO, so to speak, to go take that and do things with it. We've been quite unsuccessful in getting those things off the ground in most cases. A few we've been successful with, but mostly that's been quite difficult. And partly because the CEO is really having to provide leadership and run things, and in a sense, it's a question of can they really adapt to your vision, or are they just going to bring in some other vision that might be incompatible with the resources that you had actually brought to bear on the whole thing? I think that there's this question of sort of how important is experience in doing things like running companies. There'll be many mistakes. I've got to say, I've been CEOing now for 35 years, and there's always new stuff I see. Even after 35 years, even though I've been CEOing one company, certain size, certain industry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, even with that constraint, it's been the case that there's, I would say, it's not every day that I see stuff I've never seen something like that before, but it's probably, I don't know, at least well, a couple of times a month, probably. There'll be something where if I think about it, I'm making a decision where I've never had to make a decision quite like that before. And, so it's not the case that sort of experience with experience, just like, everything, but you do know a bunch of things. And, there are plenty of places where I know, and I even know myself and our organization and so on well enough to know the first time we do this, we'll probably get it wrong. We won't get it as right as we might get it. And we gradually build up experience, and we gradually get to the point where we sort of have a rhythm and we know what we're doing, and then things work well. But I think that's yeah. So that. But I think in terms of are there things that people who've run companies for a long time know, or have operated companies for a long time know, that the people who just started doing it don't know? Absolutely. Are there things that such people might say, you've got to do this? The most important thing in a company is blah, blah, blah. Well, it might not fit the little company that is growing up, imprinted with the personality of the founding CEO and so on. I mean, I don't know, what's a good example? Oh, like for example, somebody might say to us with our company, the most important thing is that every group has to have a budget for what it's doing. Well, in our company, it just doesn't work that way. It's not how we manage things. One could manage them that way, but there will be different dynamics in the ways projects worked and things like that. If we said there's a budget, this project is going to be $1 million project. Okay, it's like I have no idea. We that's far from the way we do things. It's just like, is this a project we want to do? Is this a project we don't want to do? What resources can we bring to bear on this project? We'd like to know roughly how much it's going to cost. We have some ballpark idea, but it's no way is it this rigid budget. And no doubt, if you had a rigid budget, there are all kinds of gamings that happen, and people saying, well, I've got this $3 million budget, and oh my gosh, this project isn't going to take as much as that. What am I going to spend the extra money on? It's like, well, actually, if you're thinking about the company as a whole, it's like, hey, don't spend that extra money. Let's use it somewhere else where we actually need it. But that's not what would happen if you had budgets there. So, there are things like that where people can come in and where people can come in and sort of say, you have to do this. And then people will, and it just doesn't happen to be a fit. D0 is asking, have I seen the Google Primer app, business development as flashcards? I have not seen it. I have to admit that my reading of management advice books was never high and has arguably dwindled to zero. Perhaps to my detriment, I don't know. I think that somehow, to me, there's a certain amount of a lot of the story of managing companies is there are many different ways to do it, and you learn by doing it, and you learn your way of doing it by doing it. And if you're lucky, there are people who can give you advice about it that hopefully will be advice suitable to you and not just to them. But I think that I'm going to read a book and learn, there is just pure factual knowledge. What does an HR department do? What are some basic rules about, what are some basic principles about how you manage people, things like this. And I think those are all useful and, in a sense, but I think these things where it's like, I'm going to read this systematic course, and then at the end of it, I'm a qualified manager and I can just go out and do my thing. That can potentially work if there's a very specific company with a very specific, sort of mechanism of this is how management works in our company. And, we have such training within our company, for example, for people, but I don't think our management training would necessarily be transportable to other companies, because a lot of it is the structure relevant to the way our company is set up, the culture of our company, and so on. I need to go soon, but maybe I'll just one last question here from Slayer. how has your engagement with your company as a CEO changed since the initial founding? Did I find it difficult to stop overseeing certain things as the company grew in size? It's been very interesting for me because I have been involved in product from the beginning. I've been involved in strategy from the beginning. I have tried to not be involved in lots of specific commercial operations and operational kinds of things, even from the beginning. And so I would say that my role actually has been strange because there have been periods of time when I've been really concentrating on, for example, doing big basic science projects where I've kind of ramped down my sort of very, very hands-on role a bit. And then I've ended up ramping it up again later. And so it's been something where it hasn't been sort of a continuous gradation of going in one direction instead of another. I think it's also the case that once the company reaches a certain size of some number of hundreds of employees, as a CEO, you're dealing with, I don't know, perhaps a bit more than 50 people sort of routinely, and other people are sort of in the management hierarchy. And, it's almost scale invariant. It's like there could be 1,000 people in this group, and I would only know about the 4 people who are in sort of senior management for it. And I think that to me, I would say that the nature of my involvement has changed less than I might have thought. I mean, because I kind of set up rules at the beginning for things I wasn't going to be involved in, and I've kind of stuck to those. There were periods of time when I got a little bit less, for example, things where there were periods of time when I was like, I should let people do this thing, even if they wouldn't be able to do it as well as I can do it, because I want them to kind of learn how to do it themselves. And I gave up on that. I decided, if I realize that something is sort of not going the way it should go, and I'm capable of doing it, and will take me a fairly short time to do it, I'll just do it and show them what I'm doing, rather than sort of staying away because it's sort of, it's not my thing because I've got this person in place who's supposed to be doing this or that. It's like I take the point of view that, I've got a bunch of experience, and at times I will inject that experience when I think it's necessary, even to fairly sort of lower tiers of the company, so to speak. And I found that instead of that being, oh my gosh, you just broke the company by insisting that you're actually going to go look at this particular detailed thing, today was a strange debugging session to do with email processing, where there's sort of anecdotal, email is being lost somewhere, and it's like, look, I just want to find out once and for all. We're going to walk through what happens. How are our DMARC records presented to the world? How does this connect to that? What does our spam system actually do? Now, at some level, it's totally outrageous that a person like me is actually going in at that level of detail. But you know what? It took, 20 minutes or something. And now I have good confidence about what we're doing. I pointed out some things. We should check this. We should have a process that runs, that checks this thing. We should, do this thing, that thing, the other thing. But mostly it was just like, I have confidence in how this runs. Other people in the company can, the kind of there's something wrong with this type thing. Well, at least I can say, look, I've looked at this and there's nothing incredibly stupid going on here. I think that, and so for me, plus another point is, okay, there were things I learned about the processing of email and spam systems and so on. And I learned that it used to be the case, SMTP servers that send and receive email, they used to, back in the day, whenever those things connected, they used to send the string, pleased to meet you. And I was told today that now they send HLO or something for hello as the initial greeting. So that's a thing that's changed since I last checked into that particular domain of human endeavor. But I think but to dive in at that level of detail, it's like, okay, it takes 20 minutes, whatever. But that way, we could be spinning for months, and all kinds of crazy things could be happening, and all kinds of people could be, spinning wheels and wasting time and so on. It's better for me just to dig all the way down and understand what's happening. And plus, I find it interesting. And who knows when some detail about how email processing works and how email and DNS interact with each other will turn out to be something that I need to know for something completely different. So that's, by the way, the thing I did learn is that the number of really quite large organizations that have messy setups that are incorrect and don't check out properly with their email servers is surprisingly large, and kind of shocking, actually, that there wouldn't be a feedback loop in place that would get, like large universities and things like that to have the correct kind of configuration of their mail servers and so on. That causes trouble for people receiving mail and then validating it and so on. Anyway, I think I suppose one thing that has happened over the course of the development of our company is that I used to do a lot more kind of mentoring of specific, people at the company. But honestly, our company has grown up to the point where there are many people who can mentor people, and there's not a lot of that I end up doing. It's actually sort of a shame as far as I'm concerned, because I kind of like that, and I end up doing it in other places with sort of a combination of mentoring CEOs and mentoring kids. They're two domains of human experience where people sort of believe that anything is possible, and those are cases that are interesting for me, at least. But that's been one thing that I suppose has changed. There's been less kind of I have to kind of give sort of basic mentoring to somebody who's in some position, because most of the people have either been in those roles for a long time, or they can be mentored by somebody else who's been around for a long time. All right. Well, I think I should wrap up here for today. But thank you for all those interesting questions. And I have to say, as I kind of yak about my experiences in business and so on, it helps me to think through sort of my kind of strategy and way of understanding things. Every time I explain something, it becomes a little bit clearer to me. So I appreciate this, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to do that. And thanks for the interesting questions, and I'll see you again another time.